Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to today's panel on the green economy. My name is Nicole. I'm going to be the moderator of today's panel. And we're very excited to bring an interdisciplinary approach to today's panel with people from an engineering background, sociology, and law, and also a first-hand perspective from someone who is directly involved with the communities affected by climate change and environmental challenges. But before we begin, I'd like to thank first our sponsors and supporters, Ibra China, Sabia, Lid China, and Miguel Neto Advogados. Your contributions to this event made everything possible, and also thanking our University of São Paulo, for hosting the event. The university is turning 90 years this year, so it's an important milestone. Well, for introductions, the green economy is a very important concept, not only for economic development and sustainable development, but especially for the BRICS countries. For BRICS, the green economy isn't just about protecting the environment, it's also about shaping a new economic paradigm in which innovation is fostered, and we have cooperation addressing the global challenges that we face, especially about climate change and the green transition. We're going to have 4 speakers today. The first one is Mr. Hota Sekhota, a chemical engineer from South Africa, who will share insights with us on the country's transition towards a greener economy and towards a greener automotive industry in South Africa, and also the promising future about hydrogen technology. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Satwik Shekhar, a lawyer with deep expertise in international forums, and he will explore how the BRICS countries can leverage cooperation in environmental issues to drive mutual benefits. And then Mrs. Ankita Chakravarti, a sociologist, will highlight how academia can serve as a bridge between environmental law and the communities most in need for environmental justice, and also emphasizing the human aspect of the green economy. And finally, we're going to welcome Mr. Shubhmal Bera, a resident of the Sundarbans in India, who's been actively involved in various welfare initiatives. He'll provide us with first-hand perspective on how environmental changes are affecting the local communities and the urgent need for sustainable practice in vulnerable regions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Sekhota to start us off. Mr. Sekhota is a chemical engineering with expertise in energy generation processes and in the automotive industry in South Africa, focusing on sustainable and environmentally friendly technologies. Mr. Sekhota, if you please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon in South Africa. I'll just give you a small synopsis about what I'm going to cover. I'll cover 3 frameworks. The first one will be, I'll just put them in 3 buckets. The first one will be the global need for all of us to decarbonize, of which will be, I need to confirm something quickly here. Something popped up on my screen, English, okay. So I'll cover 3 subjects quickly with time permitting. The global need for all of us to decarbonize, to align ourselves with the grandest challenge of the 21st century. Because all of us, we are here because one of the most pressing challenge of for the next 3 decades to get to net zero by 2050. The second part, I'll cover South Africa's continued relevance in the production of the automotive sector. So then the third one, I would try to see how we as a country, we can stimulate the adoption of the local market. As part of BRICS, South Africa is one of the most developed countries in Africa. Our economy is mostly fueled by rich deposits of coal, rich deposit of diamonds, gold, and platinum. So we have a population of over just above 60 million. And so with the automotive industry, we have a huge established automotive industry, which contributes to about 5% of our GDP. And we manufacture right about 600,000 vehicles, which 360 of those are exported to out of the market, Europe and other 30 countries. So 65%, about 2/3 of our vehicles are being exported out of the country. The industry employs about 3% of total economist market. So it's very important that when we transition, we are able to sustain jobs and we are able to sustain a local economy, which is one of the most contributing alleviating socioeconomic challenge of unemployment, which is a bit higher in our country. In the same breath, transport sector is also a huge contributor to climate emissions due to tailpipe emission caused by liquid fuels, because a lot of our country is a bit open, so trucks have to move goods in between the country, and we have to mine. So a lot of trucks and equipment used for mining end up in CO2 emissions. And so South Africa has a national greenhouse emission inventory compiled by the Department of Environment, shows that the emissions from transport sector alone account for about 13% of the country's emissions. Of those 13%, 92% comes right from road and cars and trucks that are moving goods around. Therefore, with that, our president set up a presidential climate commission, and we have adopted what in the country we call just transition strategy, which outlines the way we can reduce the sector and in the same way reduce the carbon emissions and even ensure that the sector is not vulnerable to extinction due to climate change impacts. Therefore, we have set up a clear pathway to transition to the NEVs. So we have basically trying to mitigate the risk that will be, obviously Europe is moving into net zero. They are moving into not buying cars that are internal combustion engines. So we need to as well transform our manufacturing so that we start manufacturing NEVs, including hybrid cars, including electrical cars, and so forth. Therefore, what then will the just energy transition do? We will try to fast track the agency of the transition, because the rate and the pace that the NEVs are being adopted is moving at a high rate. So we need to transition our automotive industry so that it catches on with what it's on the market. So we have companies like Zero Carbon Change, which has started rolling out a national network for charging stations. And we have what we call a just energy transition implementation, which then provides us a clear roadmap for South Africa to align to our country's decarbonizational goals. Therefore, we have been training skills and engineers and artisans to make internal combustion engines. So we need to realign the skills, and we have adopted a policy framework to ensure that the employees that are currently doing automotive will be adopted into the new NEVs that it's coming. So we are rolling out renewable energy through our REPP, and we are rolling out different technology of battery storage initiatives. So we're scaling up on those two. Therefore, the global emission, it's sitting about 37%. Our emission is sitting at 13%. So our own path will be to decarbonize and own emission and try and be able to be competitive. So how do we then try and be competitive in that industry? So we will need, the government needs to have incentives to, firstly, point number one, we need to create incentive for those that come in the country to manufacture, because as it stands, we are sitting at about 25% of import tariff. So if you were to have, for anybody trying to import NEVs into the country, has to pay about 25% tariffs. So it's currently a topical issue. Do we drop the tariff so that people can bring the NEVs into the country? That will reduce all work to zero. So we need to ensure that we create incentives so that the manufacturing side becomes stronger to manufacture a lot of NEVs in our country. And another incentive needs to be incentivize customer adoption, because the customer adoption is not as big as the other countries are. So we need to be able to be competitive. We need to stimulate the shift and the transition from the automotive that we are doing and internal combustion engines to moving into the next session, which is the NEVs. So China and Norway is a good example of that. So they've made sure that local adoption and a lot of people are buying in locally. Then when we manufacture in the country, we are able to discourage imports and encourage local production and ensure that between our BRICS countries, we are able to export and import from each other between parts and the technologies for battery technology and NEV technologies that we'll have. I'm not sure how much time I still have. So that is what the country is currently doing. So I'm not sure if there are any questions from the panel.
Oh, I can bring some. Thank you, Hosta. It was very, very enlightening. You highlighted how important it is for the transition to pay attention to jobs, because
yes,
the industry employs many people in the country. How do you perceive that this transition is happening? Because it takes a while to skill workers. It takes a while for the universities to catch up, for the researchers to catch up, and then for all the engineerings, and then bring it to practice. How do you perceive this process is going?
So we have seen an early adoption of hybrid cars. So you can see there's still a bit of skepticism for people to go fully electric because of the area that they have to travel, sometimes 600 kilometers away from where they stay. So what will be the biggest incentive is for universities to adopt an early skills. We have a lot of sitters in the country that are trying to transition the skills from to electric and just energy transition to ensure that we are ready for the next transition from internal combustion and engines to EV. So we need to make sure that we realign the engineering skills from the universities and from the University of Technologies and colleges to ensure that they align with the new technologies that are coming. And so that we are able to not only transition, but the transition must be just to ensure that we secure jobs. We don't lose jobs when you do the transition, and we export the whole transition to first world countries that will bring the NEVs into the country. We need to ensure that we localize, and a lot of parts and batteries and so forth are manufactured locally.
Thank you. I have noticed in Brazil, one big challenge for bringing EVs is that the infrastructure is not completely ready, because we have places to fuel cars every few meters, but we don't really have a place to charge the new electric vehicles. And in big city centers, slowly this process is increasing. They are building new residential buildings and areas with charging spots, but it's only focused on really the mainly rich areas, and it's not spread across the country. Is that the reality in South Africa as well?
Yes, that's the reality because is the reality because you can see what I'm wearing. It's fuel is one of the biggest import in the country. We are banning it in to ensure power. We are doing, our cars are almost so. Only last year we sold about only 7.7 EVs, which is not good. 7,700, so which is not good. So we need to ensure that because of the high tariffs that brings the cars in, the electric cars are still a bit expensive. So we need to make them affordable for a normal working human beings because they are the biggest buyers of these cars. But at the same point, we don't, if we drop the tariff increase, we will be dominated by first world countries. So we need to maintain a bit moderate tariffs and to try to maybe drop the tax for people that are manufacturing and give them tax breaks so that they come and manufacture locally and the cars will be cheaper locally. And as well incentivize those that are banning least carbon from their mode of transport.
Yeah, you mentioned the developed countries. One thing that we also see in Brazil is the increasing presence of Chinese manufacturers, both producing locally and also we also import cars. It has been disrupted in the market because they bring lower prices for the vehicles. And when they bring manufacturing plants to Brazil, they also create jobs. So that's compromise, I'd say. It's not Brazilians who are producing, manufacturing. However, it's happening within the borders of our country, so it's generating jobs. How is it in South Africa? Do you see plants in South Africa?
Because we have had such a solid automotive, so we have almost everybody manufacturing their cars as well, a lot of them. And we, like I was saying, that we need to maintain the high tariffs. It looks like it's uncompetitive, but we need to maintain the high tariffs, in my view, so that we encourage local manufacturing. So local manufacturing is how we need to go, because if you were to compete with a Chinese manufacturer, you will not compete with them because they manufacture cheaper. They've been doing it for years. So whatever you do locally will not be competitive. So to maintain the competitiveness and to improve your localization, I think we need to ensure that we make it favorable and improve our infrastructure on the floor to ensure that the manufacturers from China and so forth come to our countries, our BRICS countries, to come and manufacture locally.
Then also about on the same line, China is a very important country for manufacturing batteries for electric vehicles. And a lot of the technology that's important in this transition is in the battery sector. There are new technologies related to lithium and other materials. And the core technology is important for the country, its development. How do you perceive that South Africa and the universities and the knowledge sector is catching up with this in terms of core technologies, of developing intellectual capacity to develop those?
Yes, because of our country had for a long time had to run smelters and process all our minerals. We had a huge coal-fired plant and fossil plant that used to power our nation. So we are slowly, we have adopted just energy transition. So we are moving into PVs and solar. So a lot of people are adopting that, and because of the need to decarbonize. So we are seeing not only for car technology, the university have started working on technologies to have big batteries, especially lithium ion and other ones, to store for storage and of electricity that will be run to the grid. So our country was for a long time dominated by one energy, which is our energy national energy supplier. So it has opened up. We have opened up the industry. So individuals and private companies are coming in with their technology that they can develop the electricity and store it and put it on our national grid. So we have a huge market in South Africa for everybody to come and play in for storage batteries and as well for automotive industry as well.
Thank you. Just one final question to make the transition. When this big change, this big shift towards the greener automotive industry, do you perceive this came from the South African government, or do you perceive it was a larger global shift that came to South Africa? Do you perceive these legal agreements, these agreements that we have that at first may seem disconnected from our daily lives? Do you believe they have impacted the industry directly?
I think it's two-pronged in both ways, that we have to supply somebody we were supplying people with our automotive. So the market is going extinct of fossil fuel. So we need to quickly transition into what the market demands. And in that instance, it's the market that demands that we transition into to greener technology. The second thing, I think our government has acknowledged and adopted the just energy transition. It's a huge thing in our country. We are going green. Everything else, our mining companies are adopting solar system PVs. And our government is driving a huge part of it, and they've accepted it, and it's being pushed from both the government and the market demands of the global market. So we need to still play. We are supplying about 0.5% of the global automotive market, which is a significant number. So our plan is to be by 2035, 1.1%. So if we are moving to grow the automotive market, we need to be greener and we need to be sustainable so that we are acceptable in the market.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hosta. It was very enlightening. So we now know that there is a double side of everything, both the demand and also the global shift towards a greener economy. And with that, we're going to move to our next speaker, bringing a more broad perspective on environmental issues as a whole. So let me introduce them to you. Mr. Satwik Sekhar is an international trade lawyer and trade negotiator. At present, he works as a legal consultant and assistant professor at the Center for Trade and Investment Law, CTIL, under the Minister of Commerce and Industry in India. He has more than 10 years of experience, primarily advising the government of India on its positions before the WTO, as well as negotiating India's FTAs with major trading partners, like the EU, the UK, Australia, Canada, EFTA, UAE, and etc. Welcome, Mr. Satwik. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined us online. First of all, I'd like to thank University of Sao Paulo and Nicole for giving me the opportunity to join this panel share my thoughts on the issue of green economy. I think it's a really important topic where we're looking at an entire economy going green instead of talking about specific sectors. And Mr. Yosta has very clearly uh, explained how the automobile industry in South Africa is trying to onboard green technology. And I think automobile sector is one sector which we see all around us. So the more EVs we see on the roads, we might believe that automotive sector is actually onboarding green tech. So I think they are the driving force which are quite visible to the consumers more so than any other industry. So thank you, Mr. Yosta, for sharing your thoughts on that. uh I will talk a little bit on how different governments in different countries are trying to address the issue of green economy, uh, keeping in mind the challenges which the stakeholders face, the sensitivities of the economies and the industries in specific countries, more so in the developing countries and LDCs. I'll very quickly touch upon the discussions which have been happening at the G20 level, because India was the president of G20 last year, and this year is Brazil. So I think that's just timely for me to start with the G20, and then I'll also cover up the discussions which are happening under the BRICS Plus forum, at the BRICS Plus forum, where countries are looking at more BRICS-centric approaches, because we do have like-minded countries where we're looking at similar sensitivities, similar approaches, and similar challenges which we face, whether it's about demographics, whether it's about access to resources, or or the ability to, or the lack of capacity, if I may say. And I'll very quickly cover a little bit of India's experience as well, and discussions happening at the WTO. But um, I'll very quickly start with the actual push which is happening at the G20, under the G20 leadership. The importance of the G20 leadership is really important, because this is one forum where you do have participation of the developed countries as well as developing countries. And last year we also obviously formally invited and affirmed the membership of African Union as a member of G20 as well. So I think G20 platform provides us the best opportunity to look into the ways in which the developed countries as well as the developing countries could be kind of discussing and trying to reach a common landing spot where everyone can kind of reach a common understanding on how to address this issue. Because climate change is not a local issue. It's a global issue, but it has impacts locally. So that's very important for countries to really abide by the principle of CBDRRC, which is the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective commitments. Because we do understand that the responsibility is a common responsibilities, but we do have to take commitments at our own national, subnational, and local levels to make sure that the communities, the industries, the manufacturers, the farmers, the marginalized sections are actually able to reap the benefits of the discussions which are happening at the government levels, and also at the global at multilateral levels. The under the G20 leadership, I'll just kind of throw in a few numbers to really understand how big the issue is, and that will obviously throw light on the importance of G20, because G20 membership is actually economically speaking accounts for around 85% of the global economy actually. And if you look at the GHG emissions, around 75, more than 75% of GHG emissions actually come from the G20 countries. So the G20 has a very critical responsibility in steering the global efforts towards sustainability. And it's not just about the emissions, but it's also about the resources, the global resources when it comes to the materials which have been used, whether it's about fossil fuels, and also about the resources which can be explored with respect to green technology. G20 countries consume a lion's share of that. And the consumption, on the consumption side, once again, around more than 70 billion tons of materials are utilized and consumed within the G20 countries. And so these are a few numbers where we can understand that the G20 forum becomes a really important forum, because they've been historical polluters. They are the biggest consumers of products, as well as they are these are the countries with the best possible resources to kind of utilize to make sure that the concept of green economy is not just an academic concept. It actually becomes a reality where we are looking at a circular economy, where from manufacturing and production till the final consumption, a product goes through a green supply chain. So in that light, I'll start with one very major development which happened last year under India's leadership of G20, is that there was a pact called the Green Development Pact, which was discussed and which was decided as a blueprint for the next 10 years, for the next decade, to integrate 5 separate pillars to address issues around climate change and green technology. So the first pillar is called LIFE. It's a short form for, it's an acronym for lifestyle for environment. Second pillar is circular economy. Third pillar is climate finance. Fourth is accelerating progress on sustainable development goals, because we know that the SDGs have been there for a while, but not much progress has happened under SDGs. And the last pillar is on energy transitions and energy security, because it's not just about transitioning from traditional fossil fuel energies to clean energies, but it's also about securing and sustaining the utilization of such new and renewable energy sources. So the LIFE initiative it actually promotes sustainable lifestyles through behavioral changes, encouraging consumers to adopt sustainable consumption patterns, reducing wastes, we are surrounded by electronic devices, right? So e-waste is actually a really major concern, which has an impact on not just the green economy, but also the blue economy. So when I say blue economy, I mean the oceans, obviously. So that's very important. How the consumers and the consumption patterns change is really important, and we need that mass movement at the consumer level to tap into the traditional knowledge of how to utilize these resources and have sustainable living practices. So that is a very important aspect of G20's green agenda, to talk about lifestyles, while we are already looking at the ways in which industry can onboard green technology, and countries can share their technologies and techniques around green technologies. Ankita, I guess one of my panelists has a hand raised, so
it's just something that I thought of. I mean, it just occurred to me that whatever you're talking about, the life, the idea, the lifestyle for, environmental changes and so on, which the government of India has been pushing. An important part of that is, of course, the idea of organic farming, because that is involving not just the producers who are engaging in less involvement of chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides, increasingly moving towards organic manure and organic, matter. And then, of course, the consumer, the shift at the level of the consumer, which I think Mr. Josta was also speaking about at the level of the automotive industry. So that is actually something that ties in very well with what the fourth speaker, Mr. Shoinwal Bera, is actually going to talk about. So I just thought I'll just tell you about it, because he's going to talk about organic farming. So yeah.
No, that's great. And the funny thing is, organic farming has been traditionally being practiced way before industrialization. So possibly it's time to go back to those practices, and to have the communities to have a greater say in the use of these traditional knowledge and traditional practices, and kind of decarbonize the entire supply chain, the value chain, as well as the supply chain. So yeah, we'll be really happy to hear Mr. Beera's inputs there. When it comes to India's policies, India has a national action plan on climate change actually, and it has set ambitious targets like achieving around 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030, and that's where the acceleration towards making progress towards sustainable development goals comes into the picture. And the National Action Plan looks at diving into global green growth through investments in sustainable energy transitions. And that ties up with initiatives such as the FAME initiative. We are in the phase 2 of FAME initiative. FAME initiative is something which Mr. Yosto would relate to, because it is faster adoption and manufacturing of electrical vehicles. So India is actually onboarding electric EVs quite rapidly. We have two of our homegrown manufacturers, Tata and Mahindra, who are major players in EV markets in India. One side note, one anecdote. I personally believe that Mahindra and Tata have been able to do that because they do have teams in Formula E sport. The Formula E is a Formula One type of car racing sport where we open wheel sport, where we have EVs which are racing against each other. And Tata has a team with is the TCS Jaguar team, and Mahindra also has. So I think that's a nice side note to know kind of how a sport / entertainment event is kind of helping companies onboard green technologies and actually bring that to fruition, where we do see commercial manufactured commercial like vehicles on our roads here in India. And that's something which is the best example of how having regional and global value chains and sharing of green technology can actually bring changes on the ground, on the roads, when we are talking about EVs. I know Mr. Yosta mentioned about the presence of Chinese EVs in South Africa, and even Nicole mentioned about the same case in Brazil. But I think Brazil is also a big player in Formula One, right? So maybe the next step would be for Brazilian manufacturers to get into Formula E and have that. So maybe, yeah, it's just a wishful thinking there. Anyway, so I'll come back to the agenda which I was asked to speak on. So next very important aspect is we have been talking about access to green technology, but access cannot come without costs, without finance. That's where green finance is very important. And when it comes to green finance, G20 has consistently highlighted the importance where we're talking about mobilizing financial resources to support green transitions. And that's really important, because there are a lot of renewable energy projects which are there, climate-related projects are there. And we also have to look at infrastructures which are resilient to climate change, resilient to environmental emergencies, and how they can kind of sustain the brunt of climate change, while making sure that the infrastructure remains net carbon zero. Interestingly, the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is like the United Nations Environment Program, they have a finance initiative. It's called UNEP FI. They've urged greater transparency, actually, a greater transparency in corporate and financial sectors when it comes to disclosures related to biodiversity, effects on biodiversity, and just transition plans. So I think that's very important, because the transparency when it comes to the corporate sectors and the financial sectors on their responsibility towards protecting biodiversity and just transitions is quite important, because these are called the nature positive objectives. So these nature positive objectives, they are being integrated with sustainable finance taxonomies. So in India, we have a concept called corporate social responsibility, where 2% of a company's net profits have to be mandatorily invested into corporate social into a social sector, and afforestation, building, creating carbon sinks, and promoting onboarding of responsible and sustainable consumption patterns is a very important part of CSR in India, where we have the big corporations who are engaging into who are actually engaging into these workshops and these seminars and these drives on the grassroots level to spread awareness about climate action, awareness about just transitions. So that's a very important aspect. And this was more locally, but globally, obviously, the same aspects, same aspects are being covered in international environmental frameworks when we're talking about green finance. And like, say, for example, the Paris Agreement or the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So they are also actually talking about how to utilize finance taxonomies to make sure that the transition to green economy happens, and to actually have some sort of a responsibilities and obligations on the financial sector, on the corporate sector, to make sure that they're doing the right thing, to make sure that the again, I keep going back to the value chain, because the manufacturing process actually is one of the most polluting industries in the world, when it, like, say, for example, iron and steel industry, aluminum industry, electricity industry, for that matter, so it's really important to have these corporations and the financial sector to join hands in a very transparent manner, in the way UNEP Finance Initiative has mentioned, to kind of spread the awareness, let the consumers know, let the stakeholders and the communities know that what they're doing is either not right and they need to do the right thing, or if they're doing the right thing, to onboard more and more community representatives. Say, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, when it comes to investments, there is a concept of community consent when it comes to the land which are traditionally owned by the indigenous groups. And so they do need to have a say when it comes to investments and exploitation of natural resources, and that's a very important part of green economy as well. So things are happening, although they are happening slowly. They need to happen quicker, but there has been a push to adopt nature-based solutions. The UNEP calls it NBS, nature-based solutions, to have the consumers and the marginalized communities not face the brunt of the not so clean commercial activities of the corporations. And one important aspect which I came across was the fact that UNEP has also been pushing for a need for establishing very robust frameworks to avoid greenwashing. And it's a very, very interesting term, where you see a lot of fossil fuel based companies trying to create a parallel narrative for themselves, to kind of hide away the fact, or rather distract the consumers from the environmental degradation which they've been adopting. So that's called greenwashing, where you are actually, you might not be very clean, but you are adopting different ways to create a narrative where you're working for the communities. So that's also quite important. I'll now very quickly move to the BRICS aspect, because obviously we are here talking about BRICS. One of the most important aspect of BRICS actually is the BRICS Energy Cooperation Roadmap, and this has been highlighted regularly under different BRICS forums, where they focuses on renewable energy efficiency, and green grid technologies. So that's very important. Green grid technologies. If you have a smart grid which also provides a network of infrastructure to provide access to green electricity, as well as energy storage facilities. So if we're talking about at a more regional level, how maybe one country might be more robust when it comes to clean energy, and how that ability can be utilized by the other countries. So that's where the concept of green grid technology is very important. We know that the BRICS has come out with the new development bank. So the new development bank has committed to financing projects to support clean energy. So I think that's a very, very good thing, where we are looking at clean energy and sustainable infrastructure as one of the very major and first kind of commitments which the new development bank of BRICS has looked into. India in line with its BRICS discussions, has actually created an International Solar Alliance, ISA, International Solar Alliance, which is an initiative under BRICS, as I said, where almost around 140 countries have actually committed to increasing solar energy capacity globally. And more locally here in India, in line with the International Solar Alliance, India has a One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, OSOWOG. So it's a very catchy name, but actually it does justice to what we are trying to achieve. Because it's an initiative which aims to create a transnational grid for renewable energy and energy to ensure energy access for all. This is where I was talking about the discussions happening in BRICS when it comes to green grid technologies. So that's something which India has taken an initiative in line with its commitments at BRICS. And likewise, other countries in BRICS they also kind of have taken commitments to reduce their capacities of fossil fuels and have their installed power capacity by the end of 2024. Maybe that might not be feasible. Maybe by the end of 2025, we might see a major shift towards cleaner energy, because that is actually something. There have been a lot of reports, and this commitment actually has been very, very closely being monitored by the Global Energy Monitor. It's an initiative which keeps an eye on how countries are responding to onboarding cleaner energy and reducing their dependence on fossil fuels within their jurisdictions. So it is the first time actually where BRICS has actually has reached a milestone, signaling a crucial movement in the global transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies. I'll very quickly sum up by mentioning developments which are happening more in the trade realm, where we historically trade has not really been discussed when it comes to environment and sustainability, but there has been a paradigm shift where interdisciplinary approach is being adopted, and EU has been taking the lead on such initiatives, and they have adopted measures like the European Green Deal, and it has a set of a lot of initiatives. One of the very important initiatives right now is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where they're trying to actually impose certain costs on importation of products when they reach the EU borders, on the basis of the emissions which have happened while manufacturing of those products. So that's one way where trade and environment and emissions are being discussed. I'll not get into whether that's compliant with WTO law and whether it's the right thing or not. But effectively, the bottom line is that it is not the time to look at environment and energy in isolation. We have to look at it in a more holistic manner. Trade is something where you can hit where it hurts. So there've been efforts to kind of arrest trade and regulate trade in order to disincentivize manufacturers and traders to adopt fossil fuel based energy. So you can kind of rather in other ways incentivize them to adopt cleaner technologies. So that's something which EU is doing. Likewise, for that matter, US has introduced an Inflation Reduction Act, which kind of which is designed to once again to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Lastly, when it comes to India's focus on sustainable development actually integrates climate action with economic growth, because you cannot have climate action to work in isolation while compromising on economic growth, because economic growth also equally contributes to the upliftment of the marginalized communities and our say for example our poor farmers or our small and medium enterprises. So the sustainable development actions have to have an equitable responsibility to make sure that you do have a very robust climate action plan, a mitigation plan, while also making sure that economic growth does not get compromised, because these really address the needs of a large population which India has, India being the most populous country in the world. So this, and one last aspect, that despite being such a large economy, India's per capita emission is one of the lowest in the world, actually. But despite that, India has been adopting sustainable development action plans to meet its own commitments to reduce dependence on fossil fuel energy and adopt more and more cleaner energy. We've seen these initiatives being quite successful, and the government obviously continues to increase its budget allocations to new and renewable energy sector, which is one of the very important aspects, because we cannot just rely on financial institutions and corporations to invest. The governments also have to take that initiative. So I'll stop here. I'll be happy to have some questions, and yeah, maybe more interventions if time permits. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Satwik. We did have questions from the audience, but I'll open for Mr. Hosta. Do you want to say something? You raised your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for such an insightful presentation. I just wanted to ask you one question, because we are going through a transition. We are calling it just transition. And for the communities that are coal dependent and fossil, they're sitting in this coal plant that we're transitioning into the green energy. How do we ensure that? I know it's a very complex trade-off to move from fossil fuel and coal into the green energy. How do we then ensure, with your legal background, how do we legislate and ensure that the transition is just and sustainable and retain jobs and the community continue to thrive where they are? And how do we then as well, it's a big thing that I think that universities should take on, legislate against greenwashing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Joska. Legislating against greenwashing is quite difficult, actually. But I think it's more about the awareness which you can create when it comes to greenwashing, because that's where the transparency aspect comes into the picture. You need to have legislations where you are mandating disclosure of the initiatives and the processes possibly which these corporations are adopting in manufacturing. And maybe we can have a labeling mechanism on the products where you can label the carbon emissions which had undergone during the manufacturing of your product, and possibly very stringent penal actions for wrongful disclosure of information on the labels of the products. Possibly that could be a good way to make sure that greenwashing is kind of circumvented, and the consumers actually know the realities. And and possibly, obviously, incentivizing it could be a good incentive for the corporations to have their emissions to be mentioned on the labels, because that's where the consumer preferences are shifting. I think EVs have actually played a really important role to have people educate themselves on green technologies, because we might be having electricity grids based on solar, but people wouldn't know that, but they would see electrical vehicles on the road, so they'll be like, okay, yes, that's something which is quite important, right? So I think it's only incentivized for the corporations to have these labeling mechanisms and to actually disclose their emission levels on the labels of the products. Very quickly to your first question on how to make sure that especially
transition
Yeah, that's the small enterprises possibly, right?
Yes.
So I'll talk about the bigger enterprises because they are actually creating a value chain within their ecosystem. So it's a lot easier for them. The bigger iron and steel manufacturers, the big cement companies, so they are creating and investing within their corporate value chain. And because they are the major manufacturers, they're also the major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's a good start where you can kind of have the big tech, the big corporations to kind of clean their economies, while giving a longer transition phase to the small and medium enterprises to onboard green technologies. So I think in a phased manner that could be more helpful. I might have a few other thoughts, but I guess I really don't have too much of a time. So I think that's my limited input. I'll be happy to discuss with you some separately also on that. Thank you. Nicole?
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I would like now to introduce our third speaker. Mrs. Ankita Chakravarti has been an assistant professor of sociology in the West Bengal National University of Judicial Sciences, Kolkata, and faculty in charge of the Sundarbans Climate Change Project in association with King's College in London and Jadavpur University. She is also the faculty coordinator of the KCL-JGLS NUJS Going Global Fund for Environmental Law and has been a part of the program since its inception. As a faculty member associated with the Legal Aid Society, she has been instrumental in developing the project since the beginning. Her interest in a community-centric approach to assessing legal processes and resources has led her to undertake various field studies in the Sundarbans over the last few years. So, Ankita, we've mentioned the industry, we've mentioned global forums. How do you perceive that academy works as a bridge between both industry and law, and how your project relates to that?
Thank you so much, Nicole. Am I audible? Yes. Okay. So first of all, let me just thank everyone, Nicole, University of Sao Paulo, for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. It's been a real pleasure listening to the other speakers as well. And as you discussed, because we've heard from industry, we've heard from, the trade law perspective, but the WTO perspective, the BRICS perspective in terms of regulations. And I will predominantly be focusing on the role that can be played by academic institutions and legal institutions operating at a transnational level, and the contributions that they can make for environmental advocacy and obviously towards the establishment of a sustainable and inclusive green economy. Now, this could be a path forward for BRICS Plus, which I think is important that we consider. So I think that we can all broadly agree that, we've been also talking about sort of I think the last question, if I can just come in from that, which Mr. Hosta had for Mr. Shekhar, which is that, can you really sort of have some sort of legal regulations regarding, maybe banning greenwashing and so on. And while I'm not as optimistic, let's say, as Satvik about the possibility of countries really legislating or even having the intention to ban greenwashing, because I have my doubts about it. But I think what can be done is, of course, the possibility of expanding access to justice for communities which are affected by climate change and by the problems of, global warming and so on that we are sort of dealing with. And one such initiative or one such attempt at this initiative is something that we have been trying to do over the last few years. Like Nicole said, it is a joint project between a university in the global north, that is King's College London, and West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, which is a law university in the state of West Bengal, Kolkata. And of course, in association with several other partners who have had, roles to play in between. For instance, Jadavpur University, Jindal Global Law School, and also an important legal chamber in London, which is Doughty Street Chambers. So while essentially the idea that really brought forth this, partnership that we've been trying to build is the fact that we all agreed that, building public awareness, harnessing community activism, and obviously forging academic and legal relationships is something that we must do at a cross-country level, at a transnational level, in order to realize the green economy, not just talk about it as an academic concept, but actually to implement it, right? And so this is basically going to be a small reflection on the project. But before that, I have to set the scene for the location in which this project has been conceptualized and operationalized. This part is essentially known as the Sundarbans. And the Sundarbans is essentially a very, very vast mangrove forested area. And it spans two countries, India and Bangladesh. There is over 10,000 square kilometers of area under its ambit. And it is recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Site, a Biosphere Reserve National Park. You may have heard about the very famous Royal Bengal tiger, which is indigenous to this particular area. But there is also, along with the diversity of flora and fauna, it is also home to an extremely huge human population, which has supported itself for a very long period of time by depending upon natural resources of the region. Right now, there's a lot of technicalities to the region, and the fact that there is a fresh water and a saline water sort of mixing which happens, but I don't think I will have that much time. So let me just set out that these Sundarbans deltas are essentially mangrove forests which are salt tolerant, which is an extremely important thing because they can survive in the saline waters of the Bay of Bengal and, help protect the Sundarbans and the state of West Bengal, and of course the country of Bangladesh essentially to a very large extent from land erosion, because these areas are located on the coastal boundaries of India and Bangladesh. And this is a place which is usually battered by cyclones and battered by, cyclonic storms. And in fact, as we speak today, there is a cyclonic storm called Dana, which is going to ravage Sundarbans, Calcutta, Odisha, which is a neighboring state, and also West Bengal and also Bangladesh, starting from tonight and then continuing for the next 2 days. All schools have been shut down. All tourists have been asked to leave. Fishing communities have been asked to come back, stop fishing, etc. Primarily because it is such a huge sort of an issue, really. And this is something that has been increasing. This is something that has been increasing over the last few decades. Due to the effects of climate change, it has been argued that the incidence or the frequency of such cyclonic storms and absolutely devastating cyclones and floods and so on has gone up tremendously. And people who are most affected by it are, of course, people who live in and around the Sundarbans and who belong to traditionally marginalized communities, who have been farming communities, fishing communities, hunting communities, typically engage in, say, crab collection and so on and so forth. And a lot of their land has been disappearing and completely changing in character. Their farming yield has been completely affected by, say, saline water entering into sort of previously very fertile agricultural land, which has really affected, obviously, the people of this area. Now, what is very important to note is that, like, I don't know if some of you might be aware that there are certain islands which have absolutely disappeared. Like, for instance, Lohachhara is an island which has absolutely disappeared. And as part of our project from the King's College and NUJS partnership, we visited the residents of the inhabitants who had left Lohachhara Island, and they were part of a refugee colony. And as you can imagine, the conditions of life, the quality of life in the refugee colony is absolutely terrible. And when there are repeatedly storms battering the area, again, even the refugee colony area, obviously it makes for a very, very difficult life. Now, the entire conceptualization of the process was such that because of climate change being such a product of global north-dominated activities, but which is unfairly affecting a large majority of people in the global south, that we must look at what the possible legal and soft law-based remedies are available for the communities there, right? And this is what we tried to sort of develop on the basis of, collecting evidence and carrying out surveys and lots of sort of visits and surveys and discussions with people from the community. Like I said, Shubhimal Bera, who is one of our partners, is from a welfare organization, whom we have been working with for the last few years. The idea essentially is that and this is something that Satvik also sort of touched upon, which is when he was talking about the United Nations the UNEP financial initiatives, I think it was, which talks about the importance of, say, for instance, having clear commitments to environmental protections and having clear guidelines saying that, okay, financial initiatives must be cognizant of their responsibility towards green initiatives and environmental friendly initiatives. So this is something that we tried to sort of focus on, because a large number of the activities which are, extremely closely associated with the Sundarbans are financed by banks, financial institutions in the global north. So Europe, England, and so on and so forth. I will obviously not take names because of legal reasons, but there are these organizations which have been funding a lot of activities for power plant, for coal processing plants, and for different kinds of industries based in the global south. Now, what is very interesting is that a large number of these companies would be very unlikely to be able to fund these kinds of operations in Europe or in the UK. However, they are able to do so in India or Bangladesh or part of, quote unquote, the third world, the developing world, the global south, essentially. Now, this kind of difference in business ethics, this kind of pretty much sort of very popularly accepted and legitimized way of, sort of differential ethical commitments is something that obviously needs to be highlighted, and is something that, academic institutions can sort of attempt to do. And this is what we've been trying to work towards. So basically, we've been working with the communities, collecting information and so on, in an attempt to provide a solid case using soft law mechanism and also hard law mechanisms if possible, but largely soft law mechanisms, in order to petition, organizations like the OECD, for instance, so that they control and they regulate much more strictly the financing of these organizations, which are all based in the global north, right? So as part of that event, as part of that effort, obviously, we've been basically harnessing a lot of the community activists and the people who are already working on the ground. Now, it is fair to say that while it is obviously an India and UK based operation and so on, that there is nonetheless a tremendous history of colonial partition and colonial rule, which both, India and of course, Mr. Josta would also agree, South Africa and so on. We've obviously been cognizant of that. We've tried to be as cognizant as possible, very honestly. And we've tried to take as far as possible a decolonial approach to that, in that we have always tried to highlight issues that have come forth from the community. So, for instance, one of the issues that the community has spoken about is, of course, the issue of plastic, and the fact that plastics have been, polluting the mangrove forests and sort of stifling the mangrove forests and so on. Now, a lot of this plastic has been found to be sort of manufactured locally, but then also on the model of, companies like, say, for instance, which are, based in popular foods production and so on, which are again sometimes headquartered in the global north. And collecting this kind of an information, building this information bank has been our attempt. While we have not been absolutely as successful as we would have liked, what we have come to realize is that academia and academic institutions such as legal clinics can provide the option of connecting the community with transnational, international legal and semi-legal frameworks or soft law, frameworks and processes, which they may not have been aware of or which they may not have had access to. This is where it sort of becomes quite important, because we've adopted a clinical legal education model where we have a clinic in NUJS, and we have been operating through the legal clinic in NUJS, along with the legal clinic in King's College London. And we've been trying to forge partnerships such that there is training of the students involved, there is training of the faculty involved, and eventually there, we visit the locations being as mindful as possible of the fact that, it's not an opportunity to exploit them for information, but essentially, try to be as helpful as possible in providing them access to certain international mechanisms of justice, which may not be something that obviously, a lot of people may not be aware of, which even our students are not aware of, even our faculty members are not aware of. And as part of that, obviously, we've sort of been working over the last few years. We've established long-term partnerships, and it is a continuing process. It's also important to note that there is a significant cost involved in setting up clinical legal educational initiatives, not just in terms of the financial costs, but also in terms of training the students and sort of ensuring that there is ethical sensitivity, because that is a very big issue that we sort of were dealing with, because most of our students in NUJS are also largely from privileged backgrounds, very urban backgrounds. And we were obviously conducting the study in the Sundarbans, largely sort of semi-town or rural areas of the Sundarbans. So it was very important to be as conscious as possible about our ethical commitments and to make that clear. And that was something that is a very important part of our training process as well. And of course, when it comes to a global North and a global South clinic, there is obviously the shadow of the colonial sort of past. However, as far as possible, we do try to engage in cultural exchange. And it's been quite a ride because, just as a side note, so many things are so different, including the way in which, people understand time in the UK versus India, because Indians have this idea that Indian standard time is slightly, a more relaxed version of what time is. And whereas in the UK, of course, time is taken, very seriously to the point that it is counted in seconds and so on. So even very minor things, but very interesting things about how, cross-cultural, national partnerships are actually important, but also subject to so many influences, subjected to so many, challenges. And because we started during the COVID era, it was extremely difficult because a lot of the preliminary sort of organization was done via Zoom and via endless Google Meets and, ensuring that people have access to internet and so on. So it's been a very interesting ride. But what I wanted to take forward from this and apply to this sort of forum is that while this is a partnership between a global North and a global South university, I think that there needs to be more such collaborations between global South universities and countries and universities and academic institutions, part of the BRICS countries. Because let's be honest, a major part of the importance of BRICS is the fact that we have tremendous, populational strength, tremendous demographic value, and of course, tremendous markets as well. Now, it's high time that, of course, our academic institutions also partner together and engage in networks together in order to build such clinics and in order to harness, local ways of working which have been followed, let's say, in Brazil or in South Africa, and along with those in India or Bangladesh or wherever, and, come together essentially to frame as much as possible a more equitable partnership as compared to a global North versus global South one. And this is something that I don't think has been happening as much. While there have been attempts to set up global clinical sort of initiatives, as most of you will agree, they have largely emanated from the global North. And they've started being applied in the global South, but that is largely in partnership with them. So this is an interesting area which I think really needs a lot more development and discussion, which is that how far can academic institutions and also legal institutions essentially contribute to building more of an equitable attempt at dealing with issues of climate change and so on. So for instance, one of the things that I found quite enlightening is a discussion that I was hearing about something called the Trade Lab, which again, I think Satvik and Nicole had been talking to me about. But I'm not sure whether that is a South-South partnership or a North-South partnership. I think Satvik can sort of throw light on that if he wants to.
Well, yeah, hi, Ankita. So you're right. So Trade Lab is one is Trade Lab, I think, becomes the best example which I can talk about, where you mentioned that even if these clinical legal education setups are being operated in the global South, but they've kind of emanated from the global North. So Trade Lab actually is a Geneva-based initiative. And obviously, it's the brainchild of Professor Sergio Pugh and Professor Jus Paulin. So although it's Geneva-based, but it's a clinical legal education setup where we have the law students to conduct legal research for actual beneficiaries, whether they are corporations, whether they are industry bodies, whether they are think tanks, international organizations, government bodies, any entity which wants quality legal education, legal research to be conducted on issues which are contemporary and on the ground, very important, because effectively this enables the students to actually work in the same way as we do as practitioners. When we are advising companies, when we are advising industries and the governments, this enables the students to do a similar exercise. And for that matter, here in India, we run Trade Lab Clinic in 6 separate law schools in the country. And one specific project which we worked on last year was on sustainability and EU deforestation regulation, where our beneficiary wanted, again, the beneficiary was a Geneva-based beneficiary, but their operations were in the cocoa industry. So because cocoa industry, when we talk about cocoa industry, obviously we are looking at Ghana and Africa, and we also looking at Latin America. So the purpose of the clinic was to understand the local laws of these countries, and to really understand how the discussions which are happening at the WTO or at these forums like BRICS and G20, when it comes to deforestation, when it comes to sustainable production practices, the students actually looked at what would the governments need to do and what would the communities need to do if and when the discussions which are happening at the multilateral levels actually start to be implemented for real in these countries. Although the research was specifically in the cocoa industry, and cocoa industry is actually one of the industries which is very adversely affected due to climate change. And I don't want to break the news to everyone, but we might, I hope we don't, but we can run out of chocolates in the coming few decades, because actually the cocoa manufacturing and cocoa production is going down because of environmental emergencies. So that's where the purpose was, to kind of help understand how the communities can be protected from these climate changes, and how they can be assisted from a policy standpoint to adopt sustainable production processes and make sure that the supply of cocoa continues for the rest of the world. So yeah, that's one clinic which I wanted to highlight, where we looked at sitting here. So the beneficiary was in Geneva, the students were here in India, and we were looking at regulatory policies in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So I think that's a good example of how we can kind of have academia, industry, as well as policy to come together to address these issues. So yeah, so that's something which I wanted to highlight.
Thank you so much, Satvik. Yeah, so I just wanted to bring in that trade lab connection, because we'd spoken about how that is, how that is sort of linked. Essentially, one more thing that I just wanted to point out is that while it is important, of course, to, like Satvik said, work with the communities on, the issue of moving towards a green economy approach, adopting a green economy approach, let's say centering sustainable development, and ensuring situation where we don't run out of chocolate, or we have a much more sustainable and mindful consumption of chocolate, which is something that has absolutely gone overboard. I think everyone will agree, the insane amount of chocolates available in like every supermarket, it defies how it's being produced, how it's being manufactured, and so on. So I think very anecdotally also we can agree that that's unlikely to be sustainable. But what we discovered very interestingly is that a lot of the communities themselves, because in the Sundarbans, they're so, vulnerable in terms of climatic change and so on, they are themselves adopting a lot of these extremely sustainable practices. And for that, obviously, they do need support, because as Shubhimalda will talk to you about, and, essentially moving, or the transition from chemical and fertilizer and hormone based sort of agriculture to an organic farming based sort of system involves a lot of time, costs, and that has to I mean, that has to be borne by someone, right? So like I think Mr. Hosta was also talking about how the transition to EVs is something that is, that has costs and that is going to take a lot of time in terms of a lot of factors. Similarly, this kind of transition to, say, a much more organically based system of farming and also a much more sustainable practice of agriculture, which obviously is not perhaps as profit inducing as much more chemical based, agricultural industries have been in the short term. In the long term, of course, the argument is that, historically organic farming has been the way to go, and that is essentially going to be something that possibly saves, humankind in an optimistic sense. But essentially, the practices that are being followed by certain non-governmental organizations, by certain initiatives, sponsored, of course, to a large extent by, non-governmental funding organizations and by, again, even by government practices, of course, and by government policies and schemes, etc. That has been something that has been very, very enlightening to see, because it is basically the people who are themselves most affected and the community members, and the fact that they are, moving forward with this initiative to essentially, which, essentially they do lose out a lot in terms of short-term monetary benefits. However, this kind of a change is very, it's very inspiring to sort of work with. And the other industry, like we've spoken about automotives and we've spoken about cocoa, I feel like I should point out another industry that we've studied for this project, along with the agricultural industry, which is the aquaculture industry. So aquaculture essentially is this practice of making small pond-like structures, artificially creating them, and putting in a lot of prawn babies, essentially, or prawn seeds as they are called, and pumping it full with a lot of chemicals and fertilizers, which are arguably very harmful. And then essentially, which leads to a tremendous rise in production of prawn and the subsequent export of prawn, which ironically happens across BRICS countries or across the global south as well. So for instance, aquaculture prawn production, which happens in West Bengal or in Orissa or somewhere, these products will be sent to places like, say, in the Southeast Asia and so on, where prawn consumption is, of course, much higher. And but these practices, while in the short term did induce a lot of profit, eventually it had extremely negative effects for the agriculturalists, for the waterways and, the water bodies, because obviously, like I said, Sundarbans is extremely water dependent. So that has been, and gradually what has happened is that people who've been engaging in aquaculture, while they had profits at the beginning, eventually got into a debt trap and eventually faced a lot of loss. And, they were sort of unable to come out of it. But over the last few years, particularly post the pandemic and so on, a lot of the aquacultural farms have been slowly closing because they've been realizing the extremely detrimental effects that have been happening. And I think for this, in order to highlight this, in order to get more funding into, sustainable practices of the community, we need academic initiatives, we need legal level, policy level initiatives. And for that, BRICS level countries need to come together. We need to find, some sort of an academic partnership, because I think that would be something that could really take this forward, because it's high time that, countries in the global south have a lot more say in protecting the environment, as opposed, because, they have not historically been the largest polluters. And it is the people who have contributed the least to global warming and to climate change who are actually the most marginalized and suffering from the most effects. So, and that is something that really needs to sort of change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ankita. It was an excellent example of everything we're talking about. Now I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Mr. Shubmal Bera. He's an inhabitant of the Sundarbans area, and he has been involved in various welfare initiatives for the people. As part of his work with Chetana Sangha, which is a registered organization which works for the social welfare and upliftment for the people in the Sundarbans. Mr. Bera has been a tireless campaigner for organic farming and saving the Sundarbans from climate change induced destruction. Professor Ankita is going to mediate as a translator, and please, the floor is yours.
থ্যাংক ইউ নিকোল। সুবিমল দা, তুমি যদি অর্গানিক ফার্মিং নিয়ে বা তোমাদের অর্গানাইজেশনটা নিয়ে কিছু বলতে চাও, এবার তোমাকে বলতে বলছি। তুমি বলবে, তারপরে আমি অনুবাদ করে
আচ্ছা
দেবো।
আমি ছোট ছোট করে বলবো না একসঙ্গে বললে আপনি টোটালটা অনুবাদ করবেন?
একসঙ্গে বলো, তাহলে একসাথে অনুবাদ করে দেবো পুরোটা শেষে। সুবিমল দা, শোনা যাচ্ছে না, ভিডিওটাকে অফ করে কথা বলো, শোনা যাচ্ছে না।
হ্যাঁ,
না, একটু শুনতে অসুবিধা হচ্ছে।
শুনতে পাচ্ছেন?
হ্যাঁ,
আচ্ছা, আমি বাইরে থেকে বেরিয়ে কথা বলছি, ঘরের ভিতরে নেটের সমস্যা হচ্ছে। ঠিক আছে। সুন্দরবন থেকে সুবিমল বলছি, চেতনা সংঘ। সবাইকে সুন্দরবনের তরফ থেকে অভিনন্দন জানাচ্ছি। আমরা 25 ঘন্টার পরে একটা সাইক্লোনের সম্মুখীন হব, তবুও আনন্দের সহিত আমরা সুন্দরবন থেকে আপনাদের সঙ্গে কথা বলতে পেরে খুবই আনন্দিত। অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমরা সুন্দরবনের যারা বাস করি, খুব প্রতিকূল পরিবেশের মধ্যেই কিন্তু আমরা জীবনযাপন করি। কিন্তু একটা সময় আমাদের এখানে খুবই খাদ্য সংকট হতো 1980 সালে। তখন এই খাদ্য সংকটের সময় থেকে আমরা বিভিন্ন ভাবে কিন্তু জীবিকা নির্বাহ তাগিদে তখনই আমরা কেমিক্যাল এবং সার ইউজ করার চিন্তা ভাবনা নিলাম, যাতে আমরা খাদ্য সংকট থেকে নিজেকে মুক্ত করতে পারি। কিন্তু দেখলাম যে রাসায়নিক সার এবং কীটনাশক ব্যবহার করার ফলে প্রথম কয়েক বছর কিন্তু উৎপাদন খুবই বাড়লো। পরবর্তী সময় দেখা গেল যে বিভিন্ন কৃষি ফসলের উৎপাদন খরচ বাড়লো। তাহলে খরচ বাড়ার সঙ্গে সঙ্গে কিন্তু চাষিরা অর্থনৈতিকভাবে ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত হওয়া শুরু হলো। আর যেটা দেখলাম 1990 থেকে 2000 সালে গিয়ে দেখলাম যে আমাদের প্রাকৃতিক পরিবেশের যে সমস্ত জীবকুলগুলো আছে, সেই সমস্ত জীবকুলগুলো ধ্বংস হতে শুরু হলো এই কেমিক্যাল সার আর কীটনাশক ব্যবহারের ফলে। সে কৃষি ক্ষেত্রে এটা যখনই প্রচুর পরিমাণে ইউজ করানো হলো, তখন মাছ, কাঁকড়া, পশু পাখি মারা গেল, তাদের খাদ্য সংকট হলো। এবং পরবর্তী দিনে আমাদেরও সেই জীবিকার ক্ষেত্রে আবার পুনরায় খাদ্য সংকটে শুরু হলো। আমরা 2004 সালে যখন চেতনা সংঘ আমরা নিজেরা ভাবলাম যে আমাদের সুন্দরবনে বাঁচার জন্য নিজেদেরকে ঠিক হতে হবে, তখনই কিন্তু আমরা ভাবলাম যে পূর্বে তো আমরা ন্যাচারাল প্রসেসেই তো চাষবাস করতাম, তো সেই প্রসেসই মনে হয় আমাদের এগোনো উচিত। সেই উদ্যোগ নিয়ে আমরা কিন্তু 2015 সালে আমরা হচ্ছে এক ফার্মিং এর সঙ্গে যোগাযোগ করে হচ্ছে অর্গানিক ফার্মিং এর কাজ শুরু করলাম। বিশেষত অর্গানিক ফার্মিংটা শুরু করলাম কেন না, গ্রামের যখন ওই রাসায়নিক সার কীটনাশক ব্যবহার করা শুরু হলো, গ্রামের বেশ কিছু মানুষের মধ্যে কিন্তু খুব অসুস্থতা দেখা গেল। ক্যান্সার, হার্টের মতো কঠিন রোগ, অ্যালার্জি রোগ ধীরে ধীরে বাড়তে থাকলো। তখনই আমরা চিন্তা ভাবনা করলাম যে গ্রামের অর্থনৈতিক কন্ডিশন অত্যন্ত খারাপ, তার উপরে যদি একটা পরিবারের মানুষ কঠিন রোগে, তাহলে তার পরিবারটাই তো ধ্বংস হয়ে যাবে। তখনই আমরা চেতনা সংঘ বিভিন্ন অ্যাওয়ারনেস প্রক্রিয়ার মাধ্যম দিয়ে আমরা কিন্তু জৈবিক প্রক্রিয়ার মাধ্যমে কৃষকদের হচ্ছে চাষবাস করা শুরু করালাম। এবং প্রথম পর্যায়ে আমরা বাড়ি বাড়ি গিয়ে প্রতিটা বাড়ির মাকে বোঝাতে চেষ্টা করলাম, কারণ মাই তো পৃথিবীতে সর্ব সুখ দেয়। সেই জন্য মায়েরাই কিন্তু প্রথম যখন আমরা তথ্য দিই, তাহারা কিন্তু অনেকটা মনোগ্রাহী করে শোনে। তখনই আমরা প্রতিটা বাড়িতে মায়েদের কাছে বললাম যে আপনার আগামী দিনের শিশুটাকে ভালোভাবে যদি বাঁচাতে চান, তাহলে কিন্তু বিষমুক্ত খাদ্য খাওয়াতে হবে। না কি বিষমুক্ত খাদ্য? না জৈবিক প্রক্রিয়া কিংবা ন্যাচারাল প্রসেসে তুমি যদি ফসলটা উৎপাদন করাও এবং তোমার বাড়ির বাচ্চাটাকে যদি খাওয়াতে থাকো, সে আগামী দিনে কিন্তু সুস্থ থাকবে। এই কাজটা করতে করতে আমরা বুঝলাম যে শুধুমাত্র কি খাদ্যদ্রব্য, সুষম খাদ্যদ্রব্য খেলেই কি আমরা বেঁচে থাকবো ভালো? না, কিন্তু দেখলাম যে সারা পৃথিবীতে কিন্তু বিভিন্ন প্রক্রিয়ার মাধ্যমে কেমিক্যাল পেস্টিসাইড ইউজ করছে, কিন্তু সুন্দরবনের গুটি কয়েক মানুষরা তো এটাকে রুখে দাঁড়াতে পারবো না। তখনই আমরা উদ্যোগ নিলাম যে আমরা শুধু বিষমুক্ত ফসল খাবো, এটা হয় না। তখন পরবর্তী সময় আমরা চাষিদেরকে বোঝাবার চেষ্টা করলাম এবং অনেক পরিমাণ চাষিকে বোঝাবার চেষ্টা করেছি এই কারণে যে আমরা সুস্থ থাকলে তো সারা পৃথিবীর মানুষ সুস্থ থাকবে না। তখনই আমরা জৈবিক প্রক্রিয়ার ফসল উৎপাদনের পরিমাণ বাড়াতে থাকলাম এবং তাদের অর্থনৈতিক উন্নয়নের লক্ষ্যে আমরা কলকাতায় বিভিন্ন বড় বড় মার্কেটে আমরা যেখানে অর্গানিক ভেজিটেবল খাদ্যদ্রব্য পাঠালাম, সেখান থেকে ওই সমস্ত খাদ্যদ্রব্যগুলো যেনারা আমাদের শোভানোদ্রী ব্যক্তিরা নিতেন, তেনারা অনেকটা বেশি পয়সা দিতেন ওই কৃষকদের জৈবিক প্রক্রিয়া চাষের কারণে। এই করতে করতে আমরা কিন্তু চাষিদের মনের মধ্যে একটা পৌঁছে গেলাম যে আমরা নিজেরা ভালো থাকবো, সমাজের অনেক মানুষকে ভালো রাখবো। কিন্তু পরবর্তী দিনে দেখলাম যে এই কীটনাশক সার, রাসায়নিক সার, সার এবং কীটনাশক ওষুধ ব্যবহারের প্রবণতাটা কমতে থাকছে, কিন্তু প্রকৃতি কিন্তু বিরূপ প্রকৃতি আরম্ভ করেছে। 2009 সালে আমাদের জলস্ফীতি ঘটে গেল। জলস্ফীতি ঘটে যাওয়ার ফলে আমরা অনুভব করলাম আমরা জৈবিক প্রক্রিয়ায় খাদ্যদ্রব্য খাচ্ছি, কিন্তু প্রকৃতি তো বিরূপ প্রতিক্রিয়া করছে, সেখানে চাষের ক্ষতি হচ্ছে, জীবনহানি হচ্ছে। এই করতে করতে 2020 সাল থেকে আমাদের প্রতি বছর 2-3 বার করে কিন্তু সাইক্লোনের প্রবণতা শুরু হলো। তখন আমরা পরবর্তী দিনে
না,
ভাবলাম যে
সুবিমলদা একবার আমাকে বলছে ওরা অনুবাদ করে দিতে। ঠিক আছে, আমি এইটুকু অনুবাদ করি, তারপরে
আচ্ছা,
তুমি আবার বলো। ঠিক আছে?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
Okay. Right. Allow me to translate what Mr. Bera was sort of speaking about. He was speaking in Bangla. He is a member of the Sundarbans community, of the diverse communities that live there. And like Nicole said, and he's been associated with welfare work there for a very, very long time. So at the beginning, he thanked you for inviting him and him being allowed to represent the community of the Sundarbans. Interestingly enough, like I said, they are facing a cyclonic storm as we speak, today and tomorrow. So that obviously highlights even more the necessity for talking about green economy, not just talking about it, but actually moving towards it. So he starts out by sort of documenting how his organization essentially started and how, what was the need for this organization, which sort of started to engage in organic farming. So he says that in the 1980s, there was a food crisis affecting the people of the Sundarbans communities. And there was not enough to eat, as a consequence of which chemical fertilizers were being sort of propagated. And this is something that was being done by the government as well. There was a lot of support to chemical fertilizers and to use sort of pesticides and so on in order to deal with agricultural infestations. And they were initially useful for the first few years. They did manage to essentially ensure that there is a supply of food. However, eventually it was much more expensive and the costs outweighed the benefits. Like he says that there were rising costs for the farmers, and there was a cycle of too much debt that they entered into. And also what they started to observe is, according to Shubhimalda, that all the natural resources were getting destroyed, the flora, fauna, including, of course, very important flora, fauna for them, including, the fishes and the crabs, which they have been historically and traditionally dependent on. And again, there was a cycle of crisis, this food crisis, because natural resources were getting destroyed again. So while initially useful, chemical fertilizers seem to have sort of, a best before date or something like that. In 2004, he says that they established the Chetana Sangha. Chetana means awareness and warning, essentially. Yeah, and he talks about the fact that, we gradually started to transition to organic farming because we felt that it was the need of the hour, not just to address the issue of destruction of environment, which we were seeing much more clearly, but also because, according to him, a lot of people started suffering from increasing numbers of serious illnesses like cancer, which he mentioned. So in as far as their information goes, they believe that a lot of the people were essentially suffering from these illnesses, and because they were already poor and these diseases are extremely costly to deal with, that was further impoverishing the community members and so on. And consequently, they started to understand and work with different NGOs, international bodies, to conduct awareness about the need for organic farming. And he speaks about how they started with women, typically the women who were mothers, because according to him, they were the ones who were most receptive to understanding that, organic produce will probably lead to more healthy population. And so this is again bringing in sort of the future generations aspect of, sustainable development that is so important and that we sort of keep harping upon. Additionally, he speaks about the fact that we started to realize that, if we can expand our production and if we can increase access to markets in Kolkata, which is the nearest big city, and also, neighboring cities, which have obviously a much more sort of availability of disposable populations, people who can afford to, pay just a little bit extra for the organic produce, they started to sort of expand their access. They started partnering with different kinds of bodies, governmental as well as non-governmental bodies, because they would be able to access these kinds of markets, right? And this is where he stops, and he wants to he was essentially just starting about how 2020 onwards, they are seeing that the number of cyclones have been increasing tremendously. Cyclones and floods and, cyclonic storms have been going up tremendously. Again, highlighting the fact that, the mangroves are sort of, because of the destruction of the mangroves, because of increasing commercial activity, which involves cutting down of the mangroves and so on, there has been tremendous destruction of the environmental balance. And I'll let him continue. I hope that was clear.
It was, thank you.
Shubhimal da, ebar bolo. Shubhimal da, শুনতে পাচ্ছো?
While they're opening, can I just ask a question? We have seen we're having the cyclones, everything. How does he perceive? Can I just ask, how does he perceive that the project has benefited the community? The bridge you were mentioning about academia and law and the communities, how does he see this process? Just
right. So, okay, I think he's back, but I'll just quickly answer your question. Shubhimal da, 1 minute, হ্যাঁ, আমি 1 সেকেন্ডে তোমাকে দিয়ে দিচ্ছি, তারপর তুমি বলো। So, basically, because we've been working with them over the last few years and so on, what we have tried to do essentially is document a lot of their concerns, collect more evidence about, the issues that they have raised from areas which are broader than just the ambit that is covered by their organization, because we have other partner organizations as well, and collectively try to create and formulate, like I said, soft law complaints, which can be addressed at the level of OECD, which can be addressed at the level of the United Nations and so on, which we are still in the process of framing, and such that, there will be a stricter sort of regulatory oversight as to, the funding sources of these kinds of initiatives in the global south, which are emanating from the global north. So essentially asking financial institutions in the global north to, take much more of a serious view as to their participation in, let's say, in their participation in sort of the climate change and global warming associated impacts. I'll just tell him to quickly conclude, like Nicole has told me. Shubhimal da, শুনতে পাচ্ছ? হ্যাঁ, বলছে যে ওরা বলছে যে এবার 5 মিনিটের মধ্যে তুমি একটু শেষ করো, যে ওদের মানে তুমি কি বলতে চাইছো, যে তোমাদের কি কি লাভ হয়েছে, তোমাদের এই অর্গানিক ফার্মিং করে তুমি কি কি দেখছো, আর তুমি বলছিলে সাইক্লোনের কথাটা।
অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমরা 2020 সালে যখন সাইক্লোনটা শুরু হয়, সাইক্লোন থেকে আমরা অনুভব করেছিলাম যে আমাদের সারা পৃথিবী যেটা বিশ্ব উষ্ণায়ন হচ্ছে, তখনই আমরা বুঝতে পারলাম যে ঘন ঘন যখন সাইক্লোন হচ্ছে, তাহলে বিশ্ব উষ্ণায়নের একটা প্রভাব আমরা অনুভব করছি। এই উষ্ণায়নের প্রভাবে আমরা কিন্তু আমাদের কৃষিকাজ, জীবনহানি বিভিন্নভাবেই যখন ঘটছে, তখন আমরা আগামী দিনে কি করলাম, যে এই সাইক্লোনের হাত থেকে বাঁচার তাগিদে আমরা কিন্তু ম্যানগ্রোভ, রোড সাইড প্ল্যান্টেশন, এই জায়গাগুলো কিন্তু করতে শুরু করলাম। কিন্তু দেখতে দেখতে আমরা বুঝলাম যে এই জৈবিক প্রক্রিয়ার মাধ্যম দিয়ে যেরকম কার্বন নিয়ন্ত্রণ করা যায়, আবার গাছ লাগিয়ে যেরকম কার্বন নিয়ন্ত্রণ করা যায়, এটা বৃহৎ আকারে কিন্তু করার প্রয়োজনীয়তা আছে। সেই লক্ষ্যে কিন্তু আমরা বিভিন্ন ফান্ডিং, বিভিন্ন গভর্নমেন্ট সেক্টর, বিভিন্ন মানুষের কাছে যেটা বোঝাবার চেষ্টা করছি, যে আগামী দিনে যদি আমরা মানুষ সুস্থভাবে বাঁচতে চাই এবং সুস্বাস্থ্যভাবে, সেক্ষেত্রে কিন্তু জলবায়ুর পরিবর্তন নিয়ন্ত্রণ করার ক্ষেত্রে কতগুলো প্যারামিটার কিন্তু আমাদেরকে নিয়ন্ত্রণ করার প্রয়োজনীয়তা আছে। সেক্ষেত্রে হচ্ছে রাসায়নিক সার, কেমিক্যাল, ওষুধের হচ্ছে নিয়ন্ত্রণ, সেখানে প্লাস্টিক জাতীয় দ্রব্যের হচ্ছে নিষিদ্ধকরণ এবং সেটাকে প্রক্রিয়াকরণ এবং আগামী দিনে যে সমস্ত প্যারামিটারের মাধ্যম দিয়ে এই তাপমাত্রা নিয়ন্ত্রণ করা যায়, যেখানে সোলার প্যানেলের মাধ্যম দিয়ে সোলার সিস্টেমের হচ্ছে পাম্প সেট, এবং সাইক্লোনের ফলে যে কৃষক তার চাষবাস থেকে যে দূরে সরে গিয়ে সে মাইগ্রেশন হয়ে যাচ্ছে, তাহলে আগামী দিনে আবার খাদ্য সংকটের হওয়ার সম্ভাবনা আছে। সেই জন্য বিকল্প তাকে লাইভলিহুড প্রমোট করা, এবং সেই লাইভলিহুডটা হবে অর্গানিক ফার্মিং এর মাধ্যম দিয়ে। এইভাবেই কিন্তু আগামী দিনে আমরা এগোতে চাইছি, এবং এই বার্তাটা দিতে চাইছি বড় বড় কার্বন ক্রেডিট কোম্পানিগুলো আগামী দিনে এই সুন্দরবনের এগ্রিকালচার সেক্টরের উপর যাতে অর্গানিক ফার্মিং এর উপর এগিয়ে আসতে পারে, কিংবা গভর্নমেন্ট, তাহলে আমরা সারা পৃথিবীকে অনেক দিন ধরে সুস্থভাবে রাখতে পারবো এবং মানুষ দীর্ঘায়ু ভাবে বাঁচতে পারবে। এই হচ্ছে আমাদের তরফ থেকে বার্তা।
Thank you, Shubhimalda. So if I can quickly translate, so he was, like I said, he was talking about the fact that since 2020, they've seen an increased incidence in the frequency of cyclones and and floods and so on. And they've started to understand much more deeply how important the issue of global warming is and how important it is to tackle global warming, because they are the ones who are going to be in the first line of fire, so to say. And they have also he also spoke about the fact that, all these traditional activities that they have engaged in, whether that is farming, whether that is fishing, whether that is crab collection, etc., has all been affected tremendously due to this, increasing frequency of cyclones. And as a consequence, they started engaging in mangrove plantation initiatives, particularly along the sidewalks in the Sundarbans, along the roads in the Sundarbans, and so on. And his argument is that this can be done at a much greater level, obviously, because this would be crucial not just for saving the Sundarbans, but also eventually, essentially to ensure, that land erosion doesn't happen and that there is protection of the farming sort of initiatives. Because the other important initiative that they focus on is, of course, the idea of organic farming. He also spoke about, like I also mentioned, they're very passionate about the fact that plastic regulation or banning needs to happen, at least at a much more stricter level, because that is one of the major problems affecting, the sort of the blocking of canals and sort of leading to the stifling of mangroves and so on. He's also talked about the fact that there has been, because of the, the extremely uncertain climatic changes, there has been a tremendous migration away, not just from the Sundarbans, but also away from farming, which is obviously incredibly harmful, because while there is a massive population still, there needs to be a lot more effort in, increasing organic farming, helping people stay within farming or stick to farming, but obviously doing it in a way that, basically is not harmful to the planet and can ensure a longer and healthier life for everyone, and not just people in the Sundarbans, but also people all over the world. So that's essentially his message for everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankita. It was very insightful. So he mentions that there is actually a very pressing issue with plastic and the need for urgent regulation, not just the regulation, but the actual implementation of those, because they're facing issues with those. So it's really prominent. And does he comment anything on how, if there has been any improvement, any recent improvement after the interaction, after any implementation of those environmental laws, or has he perceived any recent change?
I'll ask him. Shubhimalda, ওরা জিজ্ঞেস করছে যে, শুনতে পাচ্ছ? হ্যাঁ, ওরা জিজ্ঞেস করছে যে, ওরা জিজ্ঞেস করছে যে গত কয়েক বছর ধরে যে তোমরা এই অর্গানিক ফার্মিং করছো, আর তাছাড়া যে সরকারের তরফ থেকে ওই উষ্ণায়ন নিয়ে আর কি এত রকম করা হচ্ছে, তাতে কি কোনো সুবিধা হয়েছে, নাকি এখনো খুবই খারাপ অবস্থা?
অ্যাকচুয়ালি গভর্নমেন্টের সেই জায়গাটা এখন আলোকপাত হয়নি, এবং যেটা আমরা সারা পৃথিবীর যেটা দেখছি, 2013 সালে হচ্ছে প্যারিস চুক্তি হয়েছিল, সারা পৃথিবীর মানুষরা কিন্তু সেখানে বসেছিল যে বিশ্ব উষ্ণায়নের নিয়ন্ত্রণ করা। সেখানে কোন দেশ কিভাবে নিয়ন্ত্রিত করছেন সেখানে হয়তো আপনারা অনেক বেশি করে জানেন, কিন্তু আমরা সেই জায়গাটায় দেখতে পাইনি যে পরিবেশ নিয়ে ভাবার কথাটা এবং সুস্থভাবে জীবনযাপন করার কথাটা মানুষের কাছে আর এখনো পর্যন্ত পিছিয়ে আছে। গুটি কয়েক সংগঠন কিংবা বিশিষ্ট ব্যক্তিরা কিন্তু এটাকে আলোকপাত করে তাদের মতো করে এগিয়ে নিয়ে যাচ্ছে। তার কাছে না আছে আর্থিক সাপোর্ট, না আছে টেকনোলজি সাপোর্ট। তবে আগামী দিনে এটাকে হওয়ার দরকার আছে, সেইভাবেই কিন্তু মানুষের মধ্যে গ্রো হয়নি।
All right. So he's saying that there isn't enough initiatives really from the government in order to implement things like, seriously and effectively banning the plastic consumption and, plastic littering and so on. And even, the polluter pays principle, etc. Those are things that are not really implemented as strictly on the ground. So his argument is that whatever is happening in the Sundarbans, at least, has been largely something that they have tried to do at an individual level or at a group level, but very, very poorly funded. And there needs to be a lot more discussion. So he spoke about the fact that, at the Paris meet and so on, there had been a lot of discussions about the need to regulate, the environmental issues. However, he doesn't really think that this is translated to anything on the ground. And he thinks that this is something that, obviously because it affects them so tremendously, they believe that there should be a lot more discussion and action on this.
Thank you, Ankita, and thank you, Mr. Shubhmopera. It was actually very an honor really to have you here with us, because thank him, please, Ankita, because that brings really a fresh perspective. And it's very interesting because we had a panel with people speaking about how the automotive industry, there's this big shift coming from the global north to implement electric vehicles and reduce greenhouse emissions in the transport industry and transport sector. But from the way I see it, it's an industry that has a lot of profit involved. It's not only about the regulation, there is also an immediate return in terms of profit for the companies who comply with the transition. But we don't see the same thing with the communities because they are not profitable. So I'd say, linking to what Mrs. Satwik has mentioned about climate financing, the climate change, climate finance, we have a lot of resources for mitigation of climate change, but not enough for adaptation. I believe that in terms of regulations to adapt what the communities are living, we'll be talking about adaptation resources and not mitigation. So we see here an example of how there is an imbalance of regulation. One sector is more heavily prioritized, whereas others aren't so much. So the communities end up suffering. Does anybody here want to make any comments or questions before I go for a question from the audience? No? Well, we have a question about the OPEC plus members countries. The question is whether the inclusion of OPEC plus member countries in BRICS could be an obstacle to developing joint projects among BRICS projects on new forms of energy generations. I believe if anyone has a word on that. Quick.
Well, that's a really thank you for the question. That's a really interesting proposition to actually have OPEC plus membership to BRICS, and I think my answer is yes and no because we are looking at the OPEC countries who are diversifying from their fossil fuel based economy, and given the fact that they do have capital and resources which could be utilized in a more robust manner to invest in green tech, which they are, and there's a lot more to be done. So my answer is that there are opportunities, yes, where that sort of collaboration could be fruitful, but I'm not very optimistic because we do not see environment mitigation measures and the solutions being considered by countries purely from an environmental perspective. In other words, we do have sovereignty and geopolitical considerations involved, and when it comes to having a greater group of countries who might have a like-minded approach towards mitigating an issue or addressing an issue, we need to have it's a little more difficult to build consensus amongst the members when you have a greater diversity of the members. So it, as much as an opportunity it might provide to have OPEC Plus members to kind of join hands with BRICS Plus or be formally part of BRICS Plus, I think uh, building consensus might be a little difficult, actually. I'm just trying to be a little politically incorrect here, but I think it'll be a little difficult for having some sort of a consensus when it comes to having a common understanding on how to address the issues. And I'm not speaking on behalf of my employers. This is purely my personal inputs here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very sensitive topic. Yes, I tend to agree with you. It complicates matters, at least in terms of consensus and projects. It complicates everything. So I would like to bring this panel to a close, and thank you really much, very much, from all of you for being here, for bringing your insights to the discussion. Also, thank you, please, for Mr. Shubmal Pera for bringing his perspective, which was really unique opportunity that we had. And again, I thank in the name of the study group of the BRICS countries of the law department of the University of São Paulo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, University of Sao Paulo. I think this BRICS study group is a brilliant initiative. I might kind of take it up with my seniors to have a similar kind of setup here. Then we can have something amazing going on. Thank you, Mr. Yosta, for your inputs. Thank you, Ankita, and thank you, Shubhamalda. It was really, really good to hear, and have a great week. And thank you, Nicole, especially to you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been absolutely lovely. And thank you, Nicole, for coordinating all of it so well.
Thank you. No, really, thank you for being here. It's my pleasure. I think it was really insightful.
সবাইকে অভিনন্দন জানাচ্ছি সুন্দরবনের পক্ষ থেকে। আমরা যে আলোচনার মধ্যে আজকের উপস্থিত ছিলাম, অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ বিষয়। এই বিষয়টা আগামী দিনে সবাইকে ভাবতে হবে, সেখানে সমস্ত শ্রেণীর মানুষকে অন্তত বিবেক বুদ্ধি মনের